A rich man tried to humiliate a black waiter, but what happened next left the entire restaurant speechless. The smell of seared steak and truffle risotto lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sound of silverware clinking against porcelain plates. At the Whitmore Room, an exclusive restaurant in Newport Beach, California, the elite wined and dined without a care in the world. Laughter echoed from polished mahogany booths where deals were sealed over $300. Bottles of wine, and every waiter in the room knew their role. Be invisible, be efficient, and never forget who the real stars of the evening were. Malcolm Bennett had learned that lesson well. At 29 years old, he moved through the restaurant like a ghost, balancing plates with effortless precision. He didn't just serve food, he anticipated needs before guests even voiced them. A glass refilled before the ice melted. A plate cleared before a guest had to ask. A fake smile offered even when someone snapped their fingers to get his attention. It was just another shift. Another night spent enduring the same routine of dismissive glances and half-hearted thank yous. But Malcolm wasn't bitter. He didn't have time for that. He was here to work, to make ends meet, and above all, to stay unnoticed. Until he made a mistake. He hadn't realized he was humming, just a soft melody, something buried in muscle memory. It was a habit from childhood, something his grandmother used to sing while cooking Sunday dinner. But as soon as the sound escaped his lips, he felt it, eyes shifting toward him, the momentary break in conversation. One voice cut through the chatter. "Well, well, didn't know we had live entertainment tonight." A slow, taunting drawl, the kind that didn't need to be loud to command attention. Malcolm turned his head just enough to see him, Charles Wentworth III, seated at a corner table with two other men in equally expensive suits. Mid-50s, salt and pepper hair slicked back, a Rolex peeking from beneath a tailored sleeve. A man who owned things, businesses, property, people's respect, and he carried himself like he knew it. Charles leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his wine before resting his gaze on Malcolm. "Didn't your ancestors used to play for men like me?" The air in the restaurant tightened. Conversation slowed. Some guests chuckled nervously, others looked away. The waitstaff pretended not to hear, but Malcolm heard every word. Charles tilted his head toward the grand piano in the center of the room. A stunning, glossy, black Steinway Model B, untouched all evening. "Why don't you play us a little something, kid?" It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. A joke at Malcolm's expense. And everyone was waiting to see what he would do. But Malcolm wasn't the kind of man to fold under pressure. The room held its breath. Malcolm felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, each gaze carrying a different story. Some guests watched with mild amusement, expecting an awkward attempt at entertainment. Others turned away, uncomfortable but unwilling to say anything. A few, mostly the younger patrons, looked at Charles Wentworth with barely concealed distaste. And then there was the staff. They knew better than to react. No one here had the luxury of taking a stand, not when tips paid rent, not when management made it clear that certain guests were always right. Malcolm tightened his grip on the serving tray, his fingers pressing into the cool metal. His first instinct was to walk away, ignore the comment, pretend it never happened. But Charles wasn't going to let that happen. "Come on now," he drawled, amusement flickering in his cold blue eyes. "It's just a bit of fun. Unless, of course, you're afraid to embarrass yourself." That did it. Malcolm had spent his whole life swallowing moments like this. He had learned early on that there were two types of silence, the kind that protected and the kind that chained. And he was tired of wearing the second like a uniform. So he set the tray down. A murmur ran through the restaurant as Malcolm took slow, measured steps toward the piano. His hands were steady, his face unreadable. He could feel the shift in the air, anticipation replacing discomfort. Charles leaned forward slightly, sensing his victory. Malcolm slid onto the bench, adjusting his posture. He let his fingers hover just above the keys, feeling their cool, familiar weight. It had been years since he played publicly. Life had taken him in a different direction. But muscle memory was a powerful thing. Charles smirked. "That's it. Give us something lively." A few quiet laughs followed, but they died the second Malcolm touched the keys. The first note was soft, barely there. A whisper of sound against the thick tension in the room. Then another, a delicate ripple, as if testing the waters. Then, without warning, he played. A surge of sound erupted from the piano, rich and full-bodied. His fingers danced over the keys, striking chords with precision and purpose. Jazz blended with classical, a touch of blues threading through like a heartbeat. It was effortless. It was powerful. It was undeniable. The restaurant, once alive with conversation, was now silent. Forks paused mid-air. Wine glasses remained untouched. Even the servers had stopped, momentarily forgetting their own invisibility. But no one was more stunned than Charles. The man who had expected to witness failure, to revel in discomfort, now sat frozen. His smirk was gone. In its place, something else. Something Malcolm recognized. Shock. But Malcolm wasn't finished yet. The melody poured out of him, effortless yet intentional, like he had been waiting for this exact moment to release it. Each note carried weight, years of unspoken words, the kind of soul-deep expression that couldn't be rehearsed. It had to be lived. Malcolm didn't just play, he commanded the room. At first, there was disbelief, the kind that made people blink, lean in, question what they were hearing. Then came the awe, settling over the audience like a slow tide. Conversations had stopped completely. Even the kitchen, always a constant hum of movement, had gone eerily quiet. The piano seemed to breathe under his hands, the deep resonance filling every inch of the restaurant. He wove through styles effortlessly, classical precision melting into jazz improvisation, bluesy undertones creeping in like secrets whispered in the dark. The sound was alive, fluid, shifting between moods like a man telling his life story without ever speaking a word. Charles Wentworth III, who had been the loudest voice in the room just minutes ago, now sat stiff in his chair, gripping his wine glass a little too tightly. His smirk had evaporated. His confidence, once so tangible it dripped from every syllable, was nowhere to be found. One of the men at Charles's table cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Jesus, Chuck, you knew he could play like that?" Charles didn't answer, because he hadn't known, because this wasn't how the night was supposed to go. He had expected a joke, a clumsy, fumbling attempt that would have solidified Malcolm's place beneath him. That was the whole point, a display of power, a reminder of who belonged where. But instead, Malcolm had flipped the entire dynamic on its head, and he wasn't stopping. The tempo picked up, the energy shifting from contemplative to triumphant. His fingers blurred over the keys, each movement precise, intentional. The restaurant's patrons weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing something rare, something transcendent. A woman near the bar exhaled, almost in disbelief. A younger couple exchanged glances, as if realizing they were watching something they'd talk about for years. Even the older guests, the ones so used to commanding spaces like this, found themselves pulled into a world they hadn't expected to step into tonight. And Charles? He was sinking. The weight of the moment had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one holding it. But Malcolm wasn't done proving his point just yet. Malcolm let the music take control. He didn't think. He felt. His fingers moved with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of living inside a sound. This wasn't just playing. It was storytelling. And right now, he was telling them all exactly who he was. The song shifted again, softening, settling into something smoother. Jazz with a tinge of nostalgia, the kind of melody that made you feel like you had just stepped into an old memory. It was warm, rich, deliberate. The way the notes rose and fell, it wasn't just skill. It was something deeper, something Charles Wentworth III could never buy. Malcolm didn't look at him, didn't need to. He knew exactly how this was unfolding. Charles was the kind of man who thrived on control, who bent conversations, moments, entire rooms to his will. But not this time. This time, he was the one being moved. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff. The half smirk he had worn earlier was long gone, replaced by something unreadable. He swirled his wine glass absent-mindedly, but he wasn't drinking. He wasn't laughing, because there was nothing to laugh about. This was supposed to be a joke. But jokes don't make your throat tighten. Jokes don't make you feel small. And Charles, for the first time in a very long time, felt small. The final notes rang out, hovering in the air like they didn't want to leave just yet. A few seconds passed before anyone even breathed. The moment stretched, thick with something no one knew how to name. Then applause. It wasn't polite. It wasn't hesitant. It started slow, but then it built, growing into something undeniable. People clapped like they had just seen something rare, something they weren't sure they'd ever see again. Malcolm didn't bask in it. He simply exhaled, hands still resting lightly on the keys, and stood up. Charles's eyes followed him, searching, trying to find something to hold on to. But what could he say? He had set the stage for humiliation, but the only one exposed now was him. Malcolm met his gaze, steady and unwavering. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He didn't need to, because silence, the right kind of silence, said everything. But the night wasn't over just yet. Malcolm turned away from the piano, the echoes of the final notes still settling in the room like dust. The applause hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown louder, a ripple of admiration spreading from table to table. A few guests stood, clapping with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for something that truly moved them. But Charles Wentworth III? He hadn't moved at all. His fingers gripped the stem of his wineglass so tightly that it was a wonder it hadn't snapped. His posture remained rigid, his carefully curated aura of dominance now visibly shaken. The men at his table avoided looking at him. Even they knew this wasn't the way the night was supposed to go. Malcolm walked back toward the serving station, his expression unreadable. The other waiters were watching him now, their faces a mix of awe and silent approval. No one said anything, but they didn't have to. He had done something none of them could have. He had taken a moment meant to belittle him and turned it into something untouchable. A man at a nearby table, older, dressed in a dark, tailored suit, leaned back and let out a low chuckle. Now that, he said to no one in particular, was something else. Charles's jaw twitched. He set his glass down, too hard. The sound of it hitting the table was sharp, jarring against the hush that still lingered. Malcolm didn't stop. He grabbed the tray he had set down earlier and continued working, just like that, like nothing had happened, like this was just another shift, just another night of carrying plates and refilling glasses. That, more than anything, seemed to eat at Charles. His hands curled into fists, his face turning a shade darker. He had spent decades in control, accustomed to orchestrating moments exactly the way he wanted. But this? He hadn't just lost control of the moment. He had lost the room, and Malcolm wasn't giving him an inch back. The woman at the bar, the one who had exhaled in disbelief when Malcolm started playing, raised her glass slightly, a silent toast in his direction. The younger couple near the entrance whispered to each other, stealing glances at Malcolm as if trying to commit his face to memory. And Charles? For the first time all night, he was the one being ignored. He cleared his throat, forcing his shoulders back, attempting to reclaim even a sliver of his dignity. Not bad, he muttered, loud enough for those closest to him to hear. Still, it's just a piano. It was an attempt to diminish what had just happened, to pretend that this wasn't the first time in years he had been made to feel less. But the words felt thin, weak, because everyone in that room knew. It wasn't just a piano, but Malcolm had nothing left to prove. Malcolm didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge Charles's weak attempt to rewrite the moment, because he didn't have to. He had already won. He continued moving through the restaurant, clearing plates, refilling glasses, handling his job like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The energy in the room was different now. The guests weren't just seeing him as a waiter anymore. They were seeing him. And Charles? He was still sitting at his table, the same expensive suit, the same polished shoes, the same carefully manicured image. But there was something hollow about him now, something exposed. A waiter had outshined him, not just with talent, but with grace. Charles lifted his glass to his lips, but Malcolm saw it, the slight tremor in his hand, the smallest crack in the mask. It would have been easy to gloat, to smirk, to say something sharp that would land like a knife. But Malcolm had learned long ago, real power doesn't need to announce itself, so he simply continued his shift. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, plates clinking, conversations picking up again. But the night wasn't the same. People would remember this. They would tell the story. Some would embellish it. turn it into something even bigger than it was. And Charles? He would try to forget. But Malcolm knew the truth, the kind of truth that sticks, no matter how much you try to shake it. Because in that moment, when Charles had tried to turn him into a joke, he had done something Charles could never do. He had turned the joke into art, and art lasts. As Malcolm placed a fresh glass of water in front of a guest, a familiar voice spoke behind him, one of the older men at Charles's table. "Hey, son." A pause. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" Malcolm didn't look back. He simply gave a small, knowing smile and answered, "Same place I learned to carry a tray." And with that, he walked away. Because real power isn't in money or status or cheap attempts at belittling someone. It's in knowing exactly who you are and never letting anyone take that from you. If this story moved you, let it be a reminder. Your worth isn't decided by anyone but you. Respect yourself, know your value, and never let anyone dim your light. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it.